Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. Welcome to part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 2, Science, Matter, Energy, and Systems. So we left off in part 1 talking about different types of compounds, ionic and covalent compounds. And now we're moving on to organic compounds, which are the chemicals of life. So what is an organic compound? Well, organic compounds have to contain at least 2 carbon atoms. The one exception is methane, which is an organic compound. Only one atom of carbon there, paired with 4 atoms of hydrogen in methane. Types of organic compounds: we have hydrocarbons and we have simple carbohydrates. We also have macromolecules, which are complex organic molecules, and these would include complex carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. All right. Matter from life comes through cells, genes, and chromosomes. So again, I know you did some of this in living environment. We're going to kind of review it now in this chapter. So what are cells? Cells are the fundamental units of life. All organisms have one or more cells. What are genes? Well, genes are sequences of nucleotides within DNA, and these are the instructions that we call genetic information that create the inheritable traits that all organisms possess. What is a chromosome? Well, chromosome is something that is composed of many genes. So that is a chromosome. So what we're looking at here is strands of nucleotides, right? The double helix that you guys know and love here, talking about DNA. It contains 3 units. One is a phosphorus unit, one is a sugar unit, and then one is a base unit, labeled either A, G, C, or T. And obviously, all of this goes into the traits, the inheritable traits that all organisms have. Here is basically the relationship between all of this stuff. So again, genes are segments of DNA on chromosomes that contains instructions to make proteins, the building blocks of life. Each chromosome contains a long DNA molecule in that double helix form. A specific pair of chromosomes contain 1 chromosome from each parent. Each cell nucleus has an identical set of chromosomes, which are found in pairs. Each human cell, except for the red blood cell, has a nucleus, and the human body contains trillions of cells, each with an identical set of genes. So this is kind of the relationship from cells, chromosomes, genes to an entire organism. So again, don't need to memorize all this. I would just understand the relationships between them. Matter can change, right? We've talked about this a little bit. You guys, I'm sure, have done this in previous science classes. If we have a physical change, well, no change in the chemical composition, right? A rock breaking into half is a physical change, but it's still that rock. Maybe it's granite, maybe it's obsidian, some other form of rock, right? If it breaks in half, doesn't change its chemical, call it physical change. Chemical change is just that, when something changes in its chemical composition, right? So you dissolve rock. That rock is changing into something else, right? So we have reactants, we have products, right? And then we have some energy, some other change that occurs sometimes when you have these chemical reactions come together. So the law of conservation of matter, I think we all know this. We've done this for years, right? We can change elements and compounds from one physical or chemical form to another, but we can't create or destroy atoms. So even though we're changing the form, maybe in the chemical change, for instance, we're not creating or destroying any atoms. We're just changing them. So again, very important. What is energy and what happens when it undergoes change, right? So we just talked a little bit about matter. Energy, once again, can convert from one form to another in a physical or chemical change. But once again, energy cannot be created or destroyed, right? That's the first law of thermodynamics. Second law of thermodynamics says we always end up with a lower quality or a less usable energy than we started with, right? Because we start with energy and then that energy dissipates as we go through a system, and therefore we end up with a lower quality or some less usable energy. That is your second law of thermodynamics. Energy can come in many forms. So again, what is energy? Energy is the ability to do work. We have kinetic energy, which is energy of movement, heat energy, or electromagnetic radiation, right? All of that is kind of kinetic energy. And then we have what's known as potential energy. This is stored energy, and that potential energy can be changed into kinetic energy. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at windmills, right? What do windmills do? Windmills take the kinetic energy of the wind, right? Energy in motion, the wind is in motion, and it turns that kinetic energy into electrical energy. It's still energy. We haven't gotten rid of any of the energy. We've just changed it from kinetic energy to electrical energy. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. Again, just different types of energy. Gamma rays, shorter wavelengths, have much more energy than TV and radio waves, which have a much longer wavelength, right? So again, different forms of energy here. What is this? This is a dam, right? We have water, kinetic energy going through a dam, which basically turns a turbine, which turns that water kinetic energy, again, into electrical energy that then we can use in our homes. And we're going to have a whole unit, a whole chapter that talks about these different forms of energy, renewable and non-renewable, right? So what is renewable energy? Gained from resources that are replenished by natural processes in a relatively short time, basically a human lifespan, right? So trees, right? You cut down a tree, you plant a tree, it can grow within 100 years or so. That's an example of renewable energy. Non-renewable energy would be obviously your gas, your oil, right? Gained from resources that can be depleted and are not replenished by natural processes within the human time scale. So again, oil can be created, but it takes millions and millions and millions of years. So we consider that a non-renewable energy resource. And again, a whole chapter will be dedicated to non-renewable energy, and then another whole chapter later on in this course will be dedicated to renewable energy. We have solar energy, right? 99% of the energy that keeps us warm and supports plants and other organisms comes from the sun. Commercial energy is energy that is sold in the marketplace. It supplements the sun's energy. And unfortunately, right now, 90% of the commercial energy out there comes from the burning of fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas. We obviously need to get that number down. This is one of the main reasons why we do have the global warming issue going on with all that extra carbon in the atmosphere. All right. Second law of thermodynamics says that energy varies in its quality. Again, you're going to start off with high quality energy that will then be turned into a lower quality energy by the end of a system. That's that second law of thermodynamics. What is high quality energy? Concentrated energy with high capacity to do useful work. So high temperature heat, strong winds, right? Energy released by burning fossil fuels is high quality energy. That's why we've been using it for so long. But again, we need to kind of move away from that, and that's more on that as we go through the course. What is low quality energy? Dispersed energy with low capacity to do useful work. So example would be low temperature moving molecules. So again, first law of thermodynamics, also called the law of conservation of energy. We kind of just went through this. Energy is neither created nor destroyed in physical and chemical changes. Second law of thermodynamics states energy always goes from a more useful to a less useful form when it changes from one form to another. Usually that's because heat is released, right? So let's go back to those wind turbines, right? We have wind that is blowing the turbines, turning the turbines, which then goes into the electrical grid, right? Turns that kinetic energy into electrical energy. The problem is there's also friction, right? When the windmill is turning, there's friction between the parts. May not be a lot of friction, but there is some friction. That friction produces heat, which is part of the wind energy. So the electrical energy that comes out always going to be a little less than the wind energy that goes in because of, in that example, because of the frictional heat that is then released into the atmosphere. So again, second law of thermodynamics states energy always goes from more useful to less useful form when it is changed. So the key, and this is something that we need to kind of get to as we go through the next 50 to 100 years, is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency measures how much work results from a unit of energy put into a system. And what we need to do is improve our energy efficiency, because unfortunately, 84% of the energy used in the US is wasted. 41% is unavoidable because of that second law of thermodynamics. However, 43% of that number is unnecessarily wasted. So think about it. If we can get rid of that 43%, all of a sudden now we're saving all this energy, which could mean less use of fossil fuels to make the energy because we'll need less because we're not wasting as much. Pretty simple, right? It sounds pretty simple. Unfortunately, it always sounds simpler than it actually is. But again, these are some of the things we're going to talk about as we go through the course. All right, final part of this chapter on science, matter, energy, and systems is obviously systems. So what are systems and how do they respond to change? Well, a system is a set of components that interact in a regular way. So example, the human body, right? All our different organs and all our different processes are interacting in a regular way together. A cell, a TV set, the economy, right? All of these are examples of systems. Systems have inputs, flows, and outputs of matter, energy, and information. Feedback can affect their behavior. So this is basically just a basic example, a simplified model of a system. You have inputs from the environment, be that energy resources, matter resources, or information. They go through these throughputs, which are the system processes, and then they come out to the environment as either work or products, as either waste or pollution, or again that heat, that frictional heat in many cases. So again, just a basic model of a system. Again, the energy that goes in green always comes out a little bit less in the yellow, and that is that second law of thermodynamics. So last thing we'll talk about are systems and feedback loops. A feedback is any process that increases or decreases a change to a system. There are two types of feedback loops, positive and negative. A positive feedback loop causes systems to change further in the same direction. I want to point out, positive feedback loop doesn't necessarily mean good. And in fact, in many cases, especially in environmental science, it means bad. All right, but it's called a positive feedback loop. A negative or corrective feedback loop is one that causes the system to change in opposite directions. So here are a couple examples. The first is a positive feedback loop. This goes back to what we talked about. I believe it was chapter 1 where we talked about that experiment in the forest. I believe it was actually this chapter. Doesn't matter. It's either chapters 1 or 2. We talked about that experiment in the forest where they cut down the forest trees. On one side, they had the control. On the other side, where no forests were cut down, and we determined that the erosion and the excess toxicity of the soil increased where you had the trees cut down, right? Well, that's a positive feedback loop because the more trees you cut down, the more erosion that takes place, which then causes less trees to grow, which then causes more erosion, which then causes less trees to grow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The melting of glaciers is an example of a positive feedback loop, right? The melting of glaciers. What do we have to know about that? Well, the sun, right, shines on the earth. We have to talk about something called the albedo, right? The higher your albedo, the more reflection of that solar energy. Snow and ice have a very high albedo. So where you have an area where there's a lot of snow and ice, a lot of that sun's energy is reflected back up into the atmosphere, back up into space. However, what happens when the glacier melts? Well, now you have bare ground, right? Bare ground absorbs that solar radiation. So what happens? Glacier melts, you have some bare ground that absorbs now more radiation. What happens when you absorb more radiation? You get hotter. That heats up the ground, which melts more snow, which then exposes more ground, which then heats up more, which then melts more snow and ice, which then exposes more ground, etc., 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 until you have no more ice, glaciers, or snow left, right? That is an example of a positive feedback loop. Example of a negative feedback loop would be your thermostat in your house, right? You set your thermostat to 70 degrees. As the temperature gets above 70, what happens? Your air conditioner kicks on, right? Which then lowers the temperature down. Well, what happens when the temperature gets below 70 degrees? Your heat kicks on, right? Bringing that temperature back up to 70. And so as you go through the process, you basically kind of stay right near that temperature of 70, up, down, that is an example of a negative feedback loop. And again, we'll be talking a lot about these positive and negative feedback loops as we go through the year. So systems and feedback loops. Most systems in nature use negative feedback to enhance long-term stability, right? You would want that negative feedback loop to be stable. Unfortunately, the positive feedback loops lead to unstable conditions, which could lead to an ecological tipping point. Natural systems stuck in a positive feedback loop can reach this point, like melting glaciers. Beyond this point, system changes so dramatically that it suffers from severe degradation or collapse. And that's basically what we're going to talk about for the next couple of months here in this class. All right, so that concludes my lecture, part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 2, Science, Matter, Energy, and Systems. And as always, thanks for listening.